Margaret Henderson stood at the front of the community center's small meeting room, her eyes bright with determination. For the past 6 months, she had poured every ounce of energy into planning the annual Willow Creek Neighborhood Parade, and today was the day to unveil her vision to the HOA board and the handful of residents who had braved the chilly spring evening to attend. "Folks," she began, voice steady but excited, "this year's parade will be unlike anything Willow Creek has ever seen. We're talking new floats, live music, professional lighting, the works. And best of all, we've secured a guest of honor who will bring prestige and excitement to our little community." Heads nodded, and a few murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Margaret smiled, feeling the warm surge of pride and control she'd worked so hard to cultivate. This parade would be her legacy. But just as she clicked to the next slide of her presentation, a young board member cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Margaret, I heard from the event coordinator that there might be an additional guest we didn't talk about, someone the community really respects." Margaret's smile faltered for just a second before she masked it with a polite nod. "Ah, that. It's nothing to worry about. We want to keep the focus on the main attractions. You know, the VIP politician we invited to show support for the neighborhood's development plans." The room fell quiet. No one pressed further, but a few faces exchanged uncertain glances. Margaret sensed the subtle tension, but brushed it aside. Outside, the early evening sun dipped low behind the trees lining Willow Creek Drive. The streets were already starting to fill with children practicing baton twirls and neighbors hauling out folding chairs. The neighborhood was buzzing, everyone eager to see what this year's parade would bring. Yet beneath the festive energy, a thread of unease tugged at the edges of Margaret's confidence. A few residents had quietly approached the HOA office over the past weeks, asking questions about the guest of honor who wasn't on the official invite list. Margaret had waved off their concerns until today. Later that night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen reviewing the parade itinerary, a soft knock came at the door. Startled, Margaret glanced through the peephole, but saw no one. Just as she was about to close the door, a small envelope slipped beneath it. Curious, she picked it up and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, cryptic message. "Beware who you honor. Some legacies aren't what they seem." Margaret's heart skipped. Who could have sent this? Was it a warning, a prank, or something far more sinister? She felt a chill. Despite the warm kitchen, the parade was less than 2 weeks away, and now doubt had wormed its way into her carefully controlled world. Margaret folded the note slowly and slipped it into her pocket. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would find out exactly who this guest of honor was and why so many people seemed to care. But deep down she wondered, was this parade really going to be the celebration she imagined? Or was something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to explode? The next morning, the sleepy streets of Willow Creek stirred to life beneath a pale, misty sun. Margaret Henderson, still unsettled by the mysterious note slipped under her door, tried to focus on the growing mountain of parade details sprawled across her kitchen table. But the words echoed in her mind. Beware who you honor. Some legacies aren't what they seem. She pushed the thought aside as best she could and headed to the HOA office, determined to regain control. The community's excitement about the parade was tangible, but Margaret sensed an undercurrent of something darker beneath the surface. Inside the office, murmurs greeted her like a restless tide. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, and the usual buzz of efficient planning felt replaced by a hesitant tension. One by one, residents trickled in, clutching coffee cups and whispered concerns. Margaret's assistant, Carla approached with a worried look. Margaret, a few neighbors asked about the guest of honor again. They say they don't recognize the name on the invitation. Some even mentioned a Mr. Jenkins. Do you know anything? Margaret's throat tightened. Mr. Jenkins? No, that's not part of the official plan. The guest we invited is Councilman Edwards. That's what's important. Carla frowned. But everyone keeps talking about this Jenkins guy. Some say he's been part of the neighborhood for decades, though he keeps to himself. Margaret clenched her jaw. She was running out of patience. The parade is about celebrating progress, not the past. Let's keep the focus there. Yet even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. Why were so many people invested in this Mr. Jenkins? And why had he appeared on the guest list without her knowledge? Later that afternoon, as Margaret reviewed vendor contracts, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop ignoring the truth. Willow Creek remembers more than you think. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. Was someone trying to intimidate her? She debated calling the police, but decided against it. Too much attention could derail the parade. Instead, she emailed the event coordinator, demanding an immediate explanation about this Mr. Jenkins and the changes to the guest list. Minutes later, a reply popped up. Mr. Jenkins is an elder in the community. He served in the war and quietly helped build this neighborhood. Some residents insisted he be honored this year. I thought you knew. Margaret exhaled sharply. So this was the secret everyone was tiptoeing around. Yet instead of relief, a new irritation flared inside her. Why hadn't the board consulted her? How could they upend her carefully crafted parade without telling her? That evening, the community's social media groups were alive with speculation. Photos from past parades showed a dignified old man with a cane, often smiling from the sidelines. Comments praised his humility and service, but also hinted at buried stories. Margaret scrolled through the threads, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The parade was no longer just a showcase of floats and banners. It was a reckoning with the neighborhood's history, and her control was slipping. When she stepped outside to calm her mind, a shadow detached itself from the gathering dusk. A man, unfamiliar and somber, handed her a folded piece of paper. Before she could ask questions, he vanished into the twilight. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the paper. Inside was a black and white photo of a young soldier standing proudly in uniform. Written beneath, in fading ink, was a single word. Remember! Her breath caught. Who was this soldier? And what did they want her to remember? Margaret folded the photo carefully, a storm swirling inside her. The parade was supposed to be her triumph, but it was fast becoming a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Margaret sat at her desk in the HOA office, the faded photo of the young soldier resting under a paperweight. Her mind replayed the image over and over. The proud gaze, the crisp uniform, the quiet dignity. Who was this man, and why had someone sent it to her with no explanation? The office phone rang, breaking her concentration. It was Diane, the event coordinator, sounding unusually cautious. Margaret, I think it's time you officially meet Mr. Jenkins, Diane said carefully. Margaret's brow furrowed. I'm aware of him, Diane, but he's not part of the official plan. Why is this coming up now? There's been a shift, Diane admitted. The board decided unanimously last week to make Mr. Jenkins the parade's guest of honor. It's a surprise for the community. I'm sorry if you weren't looped in earlier. Margaret felt a flash of anger. A surprise? Diane, this parade is months in the making. How could the board make such a major decision without informing me? Diane hesitated. It's complicated. Some residents pushed hard for it. They want the parade to honor our history, not just development plans. They believe Mr. Jenkins embodies what Willow Creek stands for. Margaret's pulse quickened. And what do you think? There was a long pause. Then Diane's voice softened. I think it's time you meet him and hear his story for yourself. Reluctantly, Margaret agreed to a meeting scheduled for the following afternoon. The next day, as spring sunlight filtered through the office window, Margaret waited nervously in the visitors' lounge. The door opened gently, and an elderly man shuffled inside, leaning on a cane. His white hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes held a calm, steady warmth. Mr. Jenkins, Diane introduced. Margaret stood, extending a hand. Margaret Henderson, I'm the HOA president. Mr. Jenkins smiled kindly. Call me George. It's a pleasure. As they sat, George began to speak softly, his voice steady, but imbued with quiet strength. I've lived in Willow Creek since before the first houses were built, he said. I fought in the war, yes, but that's just one chapter. After returning home, I helped build this community from the ground up, organizing neighbors, planting trees, creating the parks you all enjoy. Margaret listened, fascination mingling with surprise. She'd never heard this story before. The parade, George continued, is more than celebration. It's about remembering who we are and where we came from. Margaret's mind raced. Could this humble man really be the heart of the community she'd tried to shape? Later that evening, Margaret returned home, her thoughts unsettled. She went through emails and community posts, discovering stories from neighbors about George's quiet acts of kindness, repairing fences, mentoring kids, attending every event. But then a sudden alert pinged on her phone. A video clip circulating. In the community group chat, it showed George years ago, speaking at a town hall meeting, passionately opposing a new development project that many now supported. His voice was firm, his conviction undeniable. Margaret felt a prick of irritation. This was the same man who had quietly derailed some of her favorite growth plans. No wonder the board had kept her out of the loop. As the video ended, the screen flashed a new message from an anonymous sender. Look closer, Margaret. Some legacies aren't what they seem. Her heart thudded. Was this just about honoring the past, or something much bigger? Margaret realized the parade was no longer a simple celebration. It was a battlefield of histories, alliances, and secrets. One she had unwittingly stepped into, and with Mr. Jenkins at the center, her carefully ordered world was starting to unravel. The morning after her meeting with Mr. Jenkins, Margaret woke to a buzzing phone and a pounding headache. She reluctantly answered, trying to sound composed. Margaret, it's Carla. You need to come down to the park right away. Her assistant's voice was tense. Something's wrong. Margaret dressed quickly and rushed outside. A crowd had gathered near the parade's main staging area, where volunteers and vendors had been working non-stop for weeks. The colorful banners Margaret had painstakingly selected hung in tatters, shredded by some unknown force. Who would do this? Margaret muttered, feeling a flare of anger and helplessness. Carla pointed to the smashed floats, their delicate decorations crushed and scattered. We don't know yet, but the floats aren't the only thing. The sound system is completely fried. Someone must have tampered with it last night. Margaret's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an accident. It was sabotage. She scanned the crowd and noticed a few neighbors exchanging uneasy looks. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others avoided her gaze altogether. Margaret, someone's trying to make us look bad, Carla said. Maybe even sabotage the parade completely. Margaret clenched her fists. The parade was supposed to unite the community, but now it felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Trying to regain control, Margaret called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. The room was thick with tension as accusations flew. "I say we cancel the parade," one member declared. "Are you kidding?" Margaret snapped. "We can't let a few vandals ruin months of work." Another board member leaned forward, eyes sharp. "But if this is about Mr. Jenkins, we need to think carefully. Some people aren't happy with his role as guest of honor." Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it voiced aloud was a bitter pill. "Are you suggesting neighbors are behind this?" she asked, voice low. Several faces remained silent. The unspoken truth hung in the air. The parade was no longer just a celebration. It was a battleground for the community's soul. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A sudden noise at the window made her sit up, heart racing. She peered outside, but saw nothing but shadows dancing in the streetlight's glow. Then she noticed a small envelope, tucked just beneath the windowsill. Her hands trembled as she pulled it inside. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. "The past won't be buried. Neither will the truth." Margaret's breath hitched. Was this warning or threat? The following morning, a local teenager named Lily appeared at the HOA office, clutching an old worn folder. "Ms. Henderson, I think you should see this," Lily said nervously. Margaret opened the folder to find yellowed newspaper clippings, photos, and handwritten notes, all about Mr. Jenkins. The headlines spoke of a controversial battle years ago, where George Jenkins had stood against powerful developers, trying to change Willow Creek. There were hints of political deals, community fights, and even a mysterious fire that had destroyed a local building. Margaret stared, astonished. Had the sabotage been triggered by those old wounds reopening? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Margaret arranged to meet Lily and some other longtime residents who remembered the conflicts. As they spoke, a complicated picture emerged. Mr. Jenkins was not just a humble elder, but a man with a fierce past, one that still divided the neighborhood. Margaret's mind swirled with questions. Was she ready to confront the truths buried beneath the parade's colorful facade? Or would the exploding tensions finally destroy the fragile peace she'd tried so hard to maintain? The morning of the parade dawned with an eerie stillness. A heavy fog curled around the houses of Willow Creek, muffling the usual morning chatter. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, staring down at the empty street. Decorations fluttered in the mist, giving the illusion of celebration. But to Margaret, it all felt like camouflage for something darker. She hadn't slept. Her mind had replayed every conversation, every warning, and every whispered rumor from the last week. Mr. Jenkins wasn't just a beloved war veteran. He was a man with history. Messy, complicated, and unresolved. And somehow she'd become the unwilling center of a storm that had been brewing for decades. By the time she reached the main parade route, the fog had begun to lift. Children in red, white, and blue costumes lined up with balloons. Floats creaked into place, and lawn chairs dotted the sidewalks. It all looked perfect. Too perfect. Carla rushed over, clipboard in hand. Everything's holding together so far. The sound system is patched. We have music. We have speakers. The councilman is arriving at noon sharp. Margaret nodded, but kept scanning the crowd. Where's Mr. Jenkins? He's scheduled to arrive just before the first float, Carla said. The board wanted it to be symbolic. Him leading the way. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Symbolic, she thought bitterly. As if I were the villain in my own parade. At exactly 11:58 a.m., a hush fell over the crowd. A small vintage car pulled up slowly in front of the grandstand. The door opened, and Mr. Jenkins stepped out. dressed in a crisp blazer adorned with military medals, his cane tapping softly against the asphalt. The applause was instant and thunderous. Margaret didn't move. Cheers erupted. Neighbors rose from their chairs. Children waved flags. Some even cried. Carla nudged her. You should say something. You're the president. Margaret stepped forward reluctantly, feeling like she was walking toward an ambush, rather than a podium. The microphone squealed as she tapped it, then steadied. Good afternoon, she began, voice tight. Welcome to the Willow Creek Annual Parade. Another round of cheers. She glanced over at Mr. Jenkins, who nodded politely. His face was calm, unreadable. Margaret tried to continue. Today, we honor progress, community, and legacy. The words felt hollow in her mouth. And as some of you know, we also have a very special guest, someone who, she hesitated, was not part of the original plan. The crowd quieted, sensing something shift in her tone. Margaret's fingers gripped the podium's edge. Mr. George Jenkins is a figure with a long history in Willow Creek. Some say he built this place. Others say he nearly tore it apart. Gasps scattered through the audience. A man in the second row stood abruptly, frowning. Carla whispered urgently, Margaret! But it was too late. Margaret's voice rose. Let's not pretend we all agree on the past. Some legacies are complicated. Some come with baggage we've buried too long. She stepped back from the mic, breath ragged. The silence was deafening. Mr. Jenkins slowly walked toward her, steady despite the cane. He took the mic with practiced ease. I may have made enemies, he said, and I made mistakes, but I never stopped loving this place. I didn't come here to steal anyone's parade. I came because I was asked by the people who remembered. Then, softly, I didn't ask to be honored, but I will not be erased. Margaret felt the words land like stones in her chest. A low murmur began in the crowd. Sympathy, confusion, and something else. Division. The parade hadn't started yet, but Margaret could feel it. It was no longer just a celebration. It was a reckoning. And she had just drawn the battle line in front of the whole neighborhood. The silence that followed George Jenkins' words was deeper than any applause could have been. It echoed through the grandstand and down the parade route, over the sound of fluttering flags and the soft squeak of balloon strings in the wind. Margaret didn't respond. Couldn't. She stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders, like the humid air hanging above Willow Creek. And then, a slow, deliberate clap. From the back of the crowd, a woman with a faded red sash stepped forward. He's right, she called. He was asked. And not by the board, not by any committee, by us. The people who remember what Willow Creek used to be before it turned into a construction site. More murmurs. A man in a gardening hat added, he fought the developers when no one else would. Protected our homes, even when it made him enemies. Margaret's face burned. She didn't recognize half these people. Older residents who rarely came to HOA meetings, who had quietly kept to themselves while she worked to modernize the neighborhood. They were here now, and they were rallying. Carla whispered, we need to get back on schedule. But the parade had lost all shape. Marching bands looked around uncertainly. Floats revved their engines, then turned them off. Parents tugged their kids closer. George looked at Margaret. Not smug, not angry, just steady. You wanted a celebration, he said, addressing her directly now. But you forgot something important. You can't build a future by bulldozing the past. The words struck like a slap. Margaret felt her breath leave her, but then something in her snapped. Not with rage, but resolve. She turned back to the mic. I didn't forget. she said, her voice taut with emotion. I tried. To protect the future. I worked day and night to organize this parade. To bring in new opportunities. Safer roads. Better funding. But I see now. I only talked to people who already agreed with me. She looked out across the divided faces. I'm sorry I made this about control, she said. But don't pretend the past was perfect either. Now, that got a reaction. Tension tightened like a drumhead. An old man near the gazebo stood and shouted, Tell her, George. Tell her what happened with the fire. Margaret blinked. What fire? The crowd shifted. George's face hardened. I told you, he said carefully. The past has its baggage. Another voice rang out. Lily, the teenager who had brought Margaret the old clippings. She held up a torn piece of paper and shouted, My grandmother said the fire at the old rec hall wasn't an accident. It was covered up. She said it was the final straw that made people stop trusting the HOA back then. Whispers turned into gasps. People pulled out phones, filming now. Margaret stepped down from the podium. What are you saying? That the HOA was responsible for that fire? No, Lily said. But someone on it was. And the board back then protected them, including George Jenkins. George's face didn't change, but his eyes turned stormy. It was never proven, he said quietly. You never denied it either. Lily snapped. The crowd erupted. Years of buried tension, of whispered stories, of old loyalties and newer resentments, all boiling to the surface. Margaret stepped back, stunned. This was the real story. Not the parade, not the floats, but a community haunted by a past no one had ever fully faced. And now, with secrets flaring like old embers, Willow Creek wasn't just watching a parade. It was watching itself unravel. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Not because of danger, not yet, but because someone had panicked and called the fire department when the crowd surged. Breaking through the barriers and overtaking the parade route, parents pulled children aside. Floats were abandoned mid-roll. The marching band stood frozen. Instruments limp at their sides. Margaret stood in the middle of it all, eyes locked on George Jenkins. You knew something about that fire, she said, not asking, declaring. George's eyes narrowed. I knew what it meant, that this community was already burning long before any match was struck. People shifted, murmuring. Old wounds were bleeding into new divisions. Willow Creek, always so tidy and performative, was cracking wide open on the pavement. Lily stepped up, holding the yellowed clipping again, the one with the photo of the charred remains of the rec hall. My grandmother always said the fire was set to stop the vote, the one about rezoning the park. George didn't flinch. She's right. A gasp rippled through the crowd. I didn't set it, George said, but I knew who did, and I didn't stop them. Because at the time, I believed what they believed, that saving Willow Creek meant stopping that deal, by any means necessary. Margaret stepped back as if slapped. You protected an arsonist. George's voice was low. I protected the neighborhood. At least I thought I was. That's what power does to people. You tell yourself it's for the greater good, that, if you just bend the rules a little, lie once or twice, it's worth it. The weight of the words hung between them. Then what's the difference between you and me? Margaret asked. You lied to protect the past. I tried to push for the future. Everyone hates both of us. George gave a tired smile. Maybe we're not that different. We both got drunk on control. The crowd was quiet now. Watching, absorbing, silently judging. Why didn't you ever say anything? Lily asked. Why lie all these years? George looked at her, his face suddenly vulnerable. Because people like their heroes simple, Clean. But I've never been clean. I've just been trying. Margaret turned toward the crowd. This is what you all wanted to celebrate, she asked. A legacy built on secrets. An elderly woman near the front stepped forward. No, we wanted truth. We wanted our story. The real one. Not just the shiny version on a pamphlet. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. A strange lightness. She stepped up to the mic one last time. This parade was supposed to showcase progress. But I see now that progress isn't banners, and permits, and new construction. It's reckoning, and healing, and maybe, she added, glancing at George. Forgiveness. She turned to Carla. Cancel the parade. Gasps. Outrage. But then silence. I'm serious, she continued. Let the floats sit where they are. Let the people walk the streets without choreography. Let the community talk, argue, remember. Let them figure out who they really are. Someone clapped. Then another. Soon the crowd joined in. Not the forced cheer of a parade, but something deeper, messier, honest. George stepped up beside her. You sure about this? No, Margaret replied. But I think it's the first real thing we've done. As the crowd began to drift, not home, but toward each other, Margaret and George stood side by side. Not allies, not enemies. Just two imperfect leaders watching their neighborhood finally wake up. The sun had climbed higher by midday, casting long shadows across the halted floats and overturned chairs. The official parade was over before it ever began, but Willow Creek hadn't gone home. Instead, something strange and beautiful happened. Neighbors formed clusters on the sidewalks. Elderly residents and teenagers sat cross-legged in the grass. People who hadn't spoken in years finally looked one another in the eye. Someone started playing music from a Bluetooth speaker. Kids danced, and for the first time in a long time, the community stopped pretending and started talking. Margaret watched it unfold from a bench near the grandstand, sipping a lemonade someone had pressed into her hand. Carla joined her, looking dazed, but lighter. Well, Carla said, that was not what we rehearsed. Margaret chuckled. Genuinely. No, it was better. George Jenkins stood a short distance away, surrounded by 3 generations of a family he once helped during a flood. No one remembered anymore. A little girl climbed into his lap like he was a favorite uncle. He beamed. For the first time that day, Margaret saw no mask on him. Just the man. And then, someone called her name. Margaret! She turned. Lily hurried toward her, waving. Something. Another envelope. This just came. It was in your office mailbox. No return address. Margaret took it, hands already tense. Another threat. Lily shook her head. I don't think so. Margaret opened it. Inside was a single black and white photograph. It was the same young soldier, the one from before. But this time, he stood beside a woman with kind eyes, holding hands in front of a house under construction. Scrawled in the corner, faded, but legible, Willow Creek, 1962, G. Jenkins and M. H. Margaret blinked. M. H. She flipped the photo over. On the back, a note. Every legacy begins with a seed. Some get buried, but some bloom later, when the time is right. Your grandmother would be proud. Her hands trembled. George Jenkins and M. H. Margaret Henderson. But her grandmother's name was Margot Henderson. Her breath caught. She looked up at it. George. He caught her gaze from across the park. And for a split second, something flickered there. Recognition, memory, and then he turned, said goodbye to the family around him, and began to walk away, not out of guilt, not out of shame, but as a man finally released from the past. Margaret stood slowly, dazed. She tucked the photo into her jacket and said nothing. She could chase after him, demand answers, confirm what she now suspected. That the man she'd been battling for control over Willow Creek was somehow part of her story. Not just politically, but personally. A forgotten connection. A shared legacy she'd never understood, but she didn't chase. Some truths, she realized, aren't meant to be shouted from podiums. Some are meant to be felt, slowly, deeply, until they change you from the inside. Week later, Margaret sat alone in the now quiet HOA office. On the wall hung a new photo collage, snapshots from the parade that wasn't. Neighbors talking, children playing. George Jenkins, laughing in the sunlight. She looked at the empty chair beside her, the one George had once occupied, before stepping away from the public eye. With a quiet breath, Margaret opened a drawer and placed the old photo gently inside. Not to bury it, but to keep it safe. Because now she understood. History isn't about, who gets the podium. It's about who gets remembered. And sometimes, the real guest of honor is the one you never knew you were waiting for. The end.